Good morning. This is June 29th, 2000, with the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I'm interviewing Dr. Melvin W. Carter for the Health Physics Society History Program. Morning.
Good morning.
Just as a brief introduction, Dr. Carter is one of the most distinguished health physicists that we have in this field. He's a former Health Physics Society president, and he is a former ERPA president. In his employment with the Public Health Service, he was awarded the Commendation Medal. Then under EPA, he was given the Distinguished Career Award. He graduated he was an alumnus of Georgia Tech. He taught for many years at Georgia Tech, and he was inducted into the Georgia Tech Engineering Hall of Fame. He was a longtime member of the National Commission on Radiation Protection and Measurement, and is now an honorary member. And he was elected to the National Academy of Engineering, which makes him one of the few engineers in the United States to have this honor, and certainly one of the few members of the Health Physics Society to be so honored. Let me begin by asking you about your early life, your family, and how you got into health physics.
First off, I appreciate that invitation very much, or the introduction. Reminds me of once when my mom did it years ago, so I appreciate that very much. Glad to be here. Looking forward to our discussion here at Georgia Tech. Rainy day in Atlanta, GA. To begin with, I'm a native Atlanta. My wife Ann and I were both born and raised in Atlanta. My mother was from England. My dad was a Canadian. That makes me a first-generation American, and I've done very well. I don't even have much accent. My dad was a brick mason and worked at that trade probably more than 50 years, a brick and stone mason. I have one brother. He was 3 years older than myself. And we have a lot of ties, by the way, to Georgia Tech. I, of course, graduated here a couple of times. My brother has a master's degree, or had a master's degree from Tech. I have a son-in-law who has a doctorate from here. I have a son that teaches here, and his doctorate is also from Georgia Tech. I have another son who, with a little luck, in about a year's time, will also get a degree from Georgia Tech. I have an oldest daughter that didn't go to Georgia Tech, but worked at Georgia Tech for approximately a year. I also have a son-in-law and a brother-in-law that are Tech graduates, so we have a lot of contacts here. As far as getting into the health physics field, this happened when I was probably working on a bachelor's degree here at Georgia Tech in civil engineering. And two of my faculty members, Robert Ingalls was one of them, and George Reed was the other. But this was in the early 50s, late 40s. But they had some contacts at Oak Ridge, and particularly Dr. Reed. And so I ended up having done the coursework. Then I went to Oak Ridge as with a fellowship under the Oak Ridge Institute of Nuclear Studies. At Reed's urging, since he had contacts at Oak Ridge. And so I got into the health physics business in a way there. However, I guess in the early days, I didn't consider myself a health physicist. During my time in the Public Health Service and the EPA, I was always classified as an engineer. So,
It's a
sanitary engineer or something of that sort. And so I consider myself really in two fields, and whether you consider them health physics or environmental engineering, the two merged as far as I was concerned. Of course, being at Oak Ridge in those days, in 1950, for example, were very heady days. K.Z. Morgan was head of the Health Physics Division. Forrest Western was there as a deputy. Mary Rose Ford, Mary Jane Cook, Myron Fair, Elda Anderson, Jim Hart, folks like that were on the training staff or on the staff for other things. The Oak Ridge Institute Nuclear Studies was headed at the time by Dr. Pollard, and Ralph Overman was the head of the training branch. So I spent about a year there working on a bachelor's degree from Georgia Tech, and in fact was the first master's candidate to go through that particular program. Now, there have been a number of doctoral candidates, but I was the first at the MS level. So that's how I got involved in health physics, if you will.
Great. You mentioned several people you worked with and some of your mentors. Do you have any other memories of such people that you'd like to bring out at this time? Or this is,
Well, like you say, I mentioned several of them, but there's certainly a number of others. At Oak Ridge, for example, they had a small group of people in the U.S. Public Health Service that were there. Ollie Plasak, Conrad Straub, Don Pecksock, and so forth. And I was very impressed with that group and worked with them when I was doing my master's degree. So as a result of that, and I was already in the Reserve Corps of the Public Health Service, having joined it early in '49 and taken a training program both in Atlanta, Columbus, Georgia, and a couple other places. So I had a reserve commission there, and the group that were at Oak Ridge, a group of probably half a dozen, that group was out of the Environmental Health Center of the Public Health Service in Cincinnati, Ohio. So I spent time there. But two of the people that I guess impressed me and influenced my early career was certainly Conrad Straub, and he was sort of the deputy to Ollie Plasak. But Ollie Plasak was probably my mentor more than anyone else. He was a very wise person. He was a good man, not only from a professional or technical standpoint, but also he was an honest, straightforward individual as a human being. And I guess he was one of my, like I say, a real mentor. And for a number of years, I worked for him in Oak Ridge then. I also followed him, if you will, into the nuclear weapons testing business as far as a health and safety program that occurred or took place in Nevada. So I was stationed there for a number of years.
well, this is probably an opportunity to ask you about your professional life in Cincinnati, Montgomery, Las Vegas, and Atlanta. That's long. I've known you almost 50 years, I think, in this professional field, and you've done an awful lot there. Could you tell us a little bit about each of these and what you feel is important efforts that were undertaken there?
Sure. I guess it's Bern, I would divide it up into sort of three periods. One of these would be some 24 years that were spent in the U.S. Public Health Service, and the last several years assigned or detailed to the Environmental Protection Agency. So that period of time was roughly 24 years. Then I was at Georgia Tech for some 16 plus years on the faculty and also involved in some research activities. So that would be another period of fairly large amount of time. And I guess the third area would be the consulting area, which certainly overlapped to my time at Georgia Tech. So I probably consulted part-time for on the order of 25 years, well, part-time as well as full-time after I retired from Tech in 1988. So,
Starting maybe at Cincinnati?
yeah, beginning with that, I was at Oak Ridge to begin with, then in Cincinnati, and originally I was involved in a household disposal project down in Florida. I ran that as an engineer, by the way, for the Public Health Service. But as I mentioned earlier, I got involved or interested later on in nuclear weapons testing activities. And Ollie Plasak had been transferred out to Nevada from Oak Ridge in like 1954. And I followed him there as basically his deputy and spent 4 years there as my first tour of duty. So that would have gone from 54 to 58. Then later on, I was assigned there from 68 to 72. So basically, I spent 8 years assigned there directly, and I spent a lot of other time passing through Las Vegas one way or the other. The National Environmental Health Center we mentioned in Cincinnati, or the Environmental Health Center. We also had several laboratories, as you remember, that divided up the country, and we did environmental surveillance and training and technical services for states, research and development activities at those multi-purpose labs. You obviously ran one of those in Cincinnati, Ohio. We had one in Winchester, Massachusetts that Dave Moeller and other people were in charge of over a period of years. I had the lab, headed the lab in Montgomery, Alabama for about 8 years, from 1960 to 68. And we also had a lab, of course, then in Las Vegas that Ollie Plasak ran for many, many years, and I succeeded him in 1968. Those activities, again, I mentioned heady times in Oak Ridge. These were certainly heady times in the U.S. Public Health Service. There was an awful lot of weapons testing going on, and a lot of us were particularly interested in the environmental side of this. A number, like yourself, were not only interested in the environmental part, but you're also interested in analytical development, development of new procedures to do environmental analyses, either more effectively, more accurately, or more expeditiously, rapid procedures to determine. So I think this particular period where we were not only running surveillance programs, but trying to develop better ways to do the business were very interesting times. And
do you want to mention some particular things you did at, let's say, Montgomery to begin with?
well, I guess as far as Montgomery was concerned, not only being responsible for the laboratory and its activities, was involved to some extent in procedures to take a look at strontium-90, strontium-89 in milk, for example. It's the same way with iod in milk. These were some of the radionuclides fission products that were of particular interest as far as environmental samples were concerned, and obviously the impact, the potential impact on the public. So those were days when, certainly in Nevada, where if you made a mistake, you could have actually injured people. So it was a time when people were doing important activities, and it really wasn't make work, it was work that needed to be done.
I think you helped the states quite a bit in the radiological field too, didn't you? Giving guidance to state radiological groups.
Yeah, each of these laboratories, and I'll mention them again, the one in Las Vegas, the one in Montgomery, Alabama, one in Winchester, Massachusetts, and the one in Cincinnati, Ohio, were all involved in states' assistance. So quite often states, and it didn't have to be states, it could be city health departments or tri-county, this sort of thing. They could also be international organizations, but many of them sent people to our laboratories for on-the-job training, as you recall. And this training activity, some of it was done on a formal basis and some on an informal basis, but it could last anywhere from a number of hours to a number of weeks or months. I remember quite often we had people from Puerto Rico, from France, and places such as this that would come to the laboratory and spend a fair amount of time being trained. And quite often this made those people a little more attractive to others when they went back home, so we found ourselves training people for jobs or job positions over and over. They'd be attractive and leave the job, and we would have a replacement that needed training. So that was part of the state assistance program. We also helped the states as far as sampling and monitoring procedures and these kind of things, and certainly from the analytical standpoint as far as measurements were concerned.
And you ran a countrywide network of sampling out of Montgomery.
Yeah, we divided the country up actually between or among the laboratories in Winchester, Las Vegas, and Montgomery, so that all the states were covered by these, and they had a regional networks, if you will, and they were pretty much supported by the labs then in very much of a complementary way as far as that was concerned. But we interacted then with the state people pretty much on a daily basis. We certainly informed them by phone and other ways of what was going on, what the results were, and this sort of thing. And obviously knowing the people and interacting with them quite well. And a lot of the people that were run through the Las Vegas program in particular that participated in the environmental monitoring program ended up with positions of more responsibility in their individual state. So we basically had a large cadre of people that had been trained in these sorts of things over the years, and I think that was a very useful thing to have done.
Now at Las Vegas, you were rather intimately involved in decision-making on should a test be performed, and after the test, and evaluating the fallout in the environment.
Yes. And that was through roles with the, originally with the Atomic Energy Commission, then with the Department of Energy. A lot of people don't realize it, but the U.S. Public Health Service and now the EPA, by delegation, had the responsibility for the health and safety of the public around places where weapons testing or testing for peaceful purposes of nuclear devices were conducted. And they had this responsibility from 1954 until the present time. There are other things interesting about the testing business, and that is for many years we've tested the British nuclear weapons in the United States rather than being tested in Great Britain or some of its territorial holdings. So this was another sort of anomaly in the system. But we related then not only through laboratory support and monitoring activities, but we also were involved in the close-in states to the test site, and roughly 6 states, but states in Nevada, California, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico, and that. And we had a program that was made to relate directly to either the governor of those states or his designated representative. These people were cleared in general from a security standpoint. We met with them periodically to inform them of activities and what the programs look like for the next several years and this sort of thing. So I was part of this team that did the briefings of the governors and their staffs in those states that I mentioned, and sometimes others. So I had an opportunity to meet people like Ronald Reagan, and for example, when he was the governor of California and whatnot, and the governors of the other states. So it was a interesting thing, and I did this under the guise of the member of the test managers advisory panel. And these were about roughly half a dozen people, the number varied, that advised the test manager on when to test a device, whether you did it at 4 o'clock in the morning or delayed it or whatever. So we not only looked at the meteorological conditions, the degree of readiness of the health and safety program, but we also looked at the technical side of it. Were they ready to measure what they needed to measure, and was flying conditions appropriate for aircraft to go up and sample the clouds and so forth, because a lot of this time we were testing in the atmosphere. So that at least is some indication of what we did. They also had a test evaluation panel, by the way, that looked at the holes in the ground when we got around to underground testing. So we actually, for a lot of years, we maintained an inventory of holes or tunnels or vertical shafts in Nevada to test nuclear devices.
For years during and after the testing, I used to meet people who mentioned their time in, brief times very often, at the laboratory being trained as monitors and for surveillance. It obviously was a very, very good thing, not only to protect the people around the site, but also to give a lot of people throughout the country training.
Well, as you recall, the Public Health Service has a commission officer program, and a lot of the people that we ran through the monitoring activity were members of the reserve program.
Yeah.
So it was a ready-made system to deal with these sorts of things. You could find people back in those days that could afford to spend a number of weeks or a few months at a time participating in the Nevada program. And like you say, their training not only helped themselves and their programs back home, but it also helped on a national basis as far as coverage of the nuclear tests from a health and safety aspect.
We have to remember that was during the Cold War, and there was this concept, potential of there sometime being a national emergency in radiological field.
That's exactly right, and this provided a base of trained people, so that if that ever had occurred, we certainly would have had a core of people that had the ability and training to deal with it.
When you retired from the Public Health Service, you were invited to fill a chair at Georgia Tech and also be the director of the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs. Do you want to talk about some of the work you did?
Yeah, I retired from the Public Health Service in 1972 and came to Atlanta on the faculty. And it was kind of interesting to come here, of course, at that time, because Tech had changed considerably from when I was a student. It was now co-ed, for example, and I'm very pleased, and I'm sure you are as a member of the faculty here, that we had such a diverse program and trained a large number of people, and a large number of those, more and more, were female. So I was very proud of that activity. But in the early days when I actually came to Tech to run the Bioengineering Center. And in addition to that, I had a faculty appointment in the school or the Department of Nuclear Engineering at the time. And then I actually transferred in 1980 full-time into the School of Nuclear Engineering, and by then I believe it was Nuclear Engineering and Health Physics, and it moved up from a department to one of the schools of engineering. And so I worked in the two areas, the Bioengineering Center, in the faculty position less, and then more in 80, from 80 on. But the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs came along a little bit later.
Okay.
And I remember one interesting thing about it. I was working for Dr. Vernon Crawford at the time and Walter Bloom, and the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs wasn't my first choice for a name. I was going to name this thing the Technology Excellence Center for Tech. and this was not allowed because by implication then other things wouldn't be this, so it became the Office of Interdisciplinary Programs. And it originally had a couple of centers under it, the Environmental Resources Center that you've headed for many, many years. In fact, I guess you still do, and you had that job in 1974, I believe, when you first came to Georgia Tech. Of course, we were very proud of you as a member of the thing for a long, long time now, and so you're a survivor.
You, in your work with bioengineering, were there any achievements that you feel?
Well, it was a period of development. In fact, it's sort of interesting. Recently, and by that I mean the last several months, I've talked to Don Giddens and other people that are involved actively in the Bioengineering Center. So and he was involved early on. And I was talking actually about let me pick up this mic, the development of the center. And it's now obviously a very large, tremendous programs now in the bioengineering, using bioengineering in a very broad sense. But in the early days, we were just planting the seeds that finally were that began to grow and have been nourished. But I remember we were trying to develop cooperative activities between Georgia Tech and Emory, for example, and these took a long, long time. I chaired, for example, for a number of years our activities with the Georgia Heart Association. Again, these relationships just took a long time. So I'm very proud of Tech now in terms of the people like Don Giddens and others that are involved in Bob Nerum in these programs. They not only have lots of students, but they also thankfully have considerable funding for those activities.
That was quite a vision that long ago.
Very much so. That it took a long time to develop, but it's certainly been a very fruitful area and one that's come to fruition and going gangbusters now.
In the nuclear, you're teaching and research in nuclear engineering and health physics. Do you want to recall something about those activities?
Yeah, we, of course, developing these programs, again, it took a lot of nourishment because, health physics in a way and nuclear engineering aren't necessarily the same thing. They may be related to some extent. But sorting these things out over a period of time took an awful lot of work by an awful lot of people. And we had a variety, I guess, of research programs at one time or another. We were not only doing surveillance and these sorts of things, but as I remember, we had some funding in transportation of nuclear materials. Environmental Resources Center received considerable funding and support. And we, of course, turned out a large number of students, primarily at the master's level. And so we've done rather well, I think, in terms of helping supply the nation's need as far as not only nuclear engineering students, but students in radiological engineering or health physics.
One of the problems, obviously, with health physics has been that it doesn't fit neatly into a category at schools. So you find health physics programs all over the place in whatever the scholastic categories are.
That's quite right.
Nuclear engineering to a certain degree is reasonable, and to a certain degree it doesn't quite fit.
That's exactly right.
You want to talk a bit about your research publications and in that area? I noticed there are a few books by your side.
Yeah, I've got a few, and I'll show a couple in a moment. I guess my publication, the one that I've been involved in, certainly you've been involved in a number of these as well. Approximately 100, I suppose, and I guess 5 or so of these were led to essentially books, if you will. And I got several of those that I could show. This one's kind of dog-eared, but it's called Tritium.
It's a good sign that it's
It's a good sign that it's been used, hopefully by many other people. So this was published in 1971, and it was based on a symposium that was conducted in Las Vegas, Nevada, on tritium, and then the proceedings were published after they had been peer-reviewed and edited. The next one is Nuclear Power Waste Technology, and this one was based on a course that we gave for the American Society of Mechanical Engineers originally.
Actually, at this point, I'd just like to mention, I think you did give quite a few short courses for people who wanted 2-week, 1 week, or that kind of training.
That's right. And this was based on one of those courses that was approximately 40 hours in length. Now, as far as I know, this course, or the rudiments of this course, are still being taught by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. So this was one where we offered the course here. We conducted it several times in the field, and then it was further developed by the Society of Mechanical Engineers. And the next one is a 2-volume thing on the management of low-level nuclear waste. This is volume 1. I also have a volume 2. And as I recall, there's some 1,200 or so pages in this, and you were one of the editors of this particular one, so your handiwork is represented here as well.
And in fact, again, this has developed into a huge field now of waste handling of
Yes,
radioactive waste.
very much so. And the last one I was involved in was the radionuclides in the food chain. This was based on a symposium we put on in Luxembourg, Austria, and we did it for the International Life Sciences Institute that was interested in that particular activity. Now, we also did one in the early 70s, or late 70s, I guess, on radioactivity in consumer products.
Yes.
So basically there were 5 of these. 4 of them came out of one thing, and then the other one was based on actually a course that we developed for the ASME. The others came out of international conferences that were scheduled.
While you were here and after you retired, you were very active in being on committees, on consulting. Actually, I think the year after you retired, it was very hard to find you anywhere except in the air or in airline terminals. You were tremendously busy. But both during your work here and after until now, you have done a lot of work, both for the federal government in sitting on committees and in consulting otherwise on a personal basis. Do you want to recall some of those activities?
Yeah, people, of course, do this in a different way. I'd like to talk, I guess, about a couple of aspects of it. One, in my own case, I decided that I would get involved in some organizations and do this on a detailed basis. In other words, if I got involved in them, I wanted to get involved in not only their meeting activities and that sort of thing, which a lot of it represents the highlights, but to actually learn something on an organic basis about the organization itself, what they did, the purpose, where the funding came from, how they developed, how people could profit by it in terms of their professional growth and development. So the 4 organizations, I guess, over the years that I selected for this, first was the Health Physics Society. And in that case, I was fortunate enough to be elected the president, as you mentioned earlier. I was elected president in 1979 at the meeting in Philadelphia, and then went out of office the following year at the 25th meeting of our society in Seattle, Washington.
But you continued participating.
Yes.
Quite a bit.
And again, I was got the Founders Award, as you mentioned, and elected fellow and honorary member and this sort of thing, and very pleased with those. But organizations such as this give you an opportunity to serve your profession, but also to serve yourself as far as your own growth and development. So I would certainly encourage this kind of activity for other people. Now, to continue with my involvement, the next organization, I guess, that I decided I would get intimately involved with the International Radiation Protection Association, or IRPA. And again, I was fortunate enough to be elected to the council at the international meeting in 1980 in Jerusalem. The next Congress was in West Berlin, and I was elected president of the IRPA. And then I went out of office in 1988 in Sydney, Australia. So again, now there's another dimension to this other than the national organization, was the international, which the Health Physics Society belongs to IRPA, and its members do also. It's a much larger organization, obviously, involving probably on the order of 40 or so countries in the world at the moment, and has a membership that, of course, is considerably larger than the 6,000 or 7,000 that are in the U.S. Health Physics Society. So this was Again, another organization that I got involved in is being on the council, being president, and then chairing the awards committee for once or twice. The other organization then that I was involved in was the NCRP, National Council on Radiation Protection and Measurements, which is a very long title. This organization, when I belonged first, or was initiated to it in 1971 for a 6-year term, and I eventually served 4 6-year terms, so that was till about 95. There were 75 members to that. As you know, you're a member of that organization. And you spend an awful lot of time in it, and again, serving on committees. Some of the committees that I served on involved administrative things, looking, for example, at membership and this sort of thing. But a lot of them were technical, and for a number of years I chaired Scientific Committee 64, which is one of their standing committees. That committee still continues today, and of course John Till chairs that particular committee, and you and I and John have been on the committee at one time together. I was also on a number of other committees that turned out reports over the years for the NCRP, and I'm an honorary member of that organization now. So this was the third one that I looked into and spent a large amount of my professional time involved in that kind of activity, serving on committees, producing reports and whatnot. And then the fourth organization was sort of a conglomerate of the academies, the National Academy of Science, National Academy of Engineering, and so forth, National Research Council. Again, I've been on the board on radioactive waste management of that group, served on probably a half a dozen of its technical or scientific committees over the years that have produced reports. One of these most recent that I was involved in was the committee to look at the background for standards for Yucca Mountain, that Congress dictated that the Academy would make a study and EPA would use their results to produce some standards for Yucca Mountain. So in my case, these are the 4 organizations that I decided I would get involved with on an intimate basis. And as you point out, or I mentioned, it takes a lot of time to do those sorts of things. So if you added it up, you're talking about a few years out of your life devoted to these things. On the other hand, I think most of us that do that sort of thing feel gratified by the results. We also feel that we've been involved in paying some of what we've gotten in our profession back to society.
Yes, it does take a lot of time, but a lot of good can come from that,
Right.
personally, to others. What about some of the federal agencies that have called upon you to give them guidance?
Well, I guess in the area, and I mentioned earlier that consulting was one of the thirds of my career, if you divided it up, I suppose. But I've consulted with a number of organizations, such as the World Health Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, Pan American Health Organization, which deals primarily with South America, but is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Also got involved in the Panama Canal Company as far as the nuclear ship Savannah passing through the canal. Involved with ILSI that I mentioned earlier as far as the proceedings of their symposium. Also got involved as a consultant to the High Commissioner of the Ryukyu Islands, which includes Okinawa. So I spent a month or so on Okinawa many years ago with that. So this is a bevy of international organizations that I've consulted with or served as technical advisor or whatever. It's also included a number of states, so the state of New York, I've been on a number of committees here in the state of Georgia for the Department of Natural Resources, the Department of Human Resources. Did one of the surveys of the Dawson Forest as far as the activities that were conducted there many years ago, and there's been small amounts of contamination left over from those activities, and periodically those are looked at and surveyed to take their temperature, if you will. Been involved with national groups, for example, the Los Alamos National Laboratory. I've chaired or been on committees for probably a period of 16 years or so with LANL. Also, the similar thing with the Pacific Northwest Laboratories. Spent probably 10 or 12 years on chairing committees for that part. Also, more recently, took a look from a health and safety standpoint, using some additional people other than myself, at the health and safety part of our gaseous diffusion plants. I did that activity last fall, for example. So I still do some activities, although these are greatly reduced from what I used to. And I've done work, of course, I mentioned Oak Ridge, these other labs. I've done Savannah River site, worked for Westinghouse, Coca-Cola, a number of other people. So there are a whole bevy of not only organizations like national labs and whatnot, but also a number of groups you wouldn't imagine maybe would have radiological problems, for example, Coca-Cola, but they do. So 88 was a big year because we dealt with some devices that had leaked radioactivity, ionization devices, and so that was involved a lot of different companies, different organizations with backgrounds, and had to do a lot of health physics activities in a hurry to get those plants cleaned up or deconned and back in operation.
A question about your view of health physics. Has it changed significantly? Is it going in some useful direction? Should we reconsider what we are doing? Do you have any suggestions?
I think the short answer to what you've asked me is yes.
Yes.
But it's interesting, having been involved now for some 50 plus years in the activity. I'd say there are a number of changes that have occurred. First, I think we still are attracting some very good people.
Yes.
If you take a look at them that are in the training programs, that are out working, I know, I'm sure you're just like I do, you're very proud when you see these sort of folks and meet them at meetings of one kind or another, and they're the ones that are giving the papers, and you're sitting in the audience listening to them. So I guess I'm always very pleased to see that sort of thing. But as far as changes that I would say that have occurred, certainly one in the environmental aspect of radiation, radioactivity, is the fact that it's been greatly legalized, if you will. And I mean that we've got a lot of lawyers involved, for example, now. And it used to be if you found a problem in a program, it usually meant your control was off, and you went in and took a look at it and found the cause and rectified it. You didn't go in and decide who needed to be sued or who had to pay a penalty or these kind of things. So the legal aspects have greatly increased, so that they've complicated life to some extent from a technical or scientific standpoint. I'd say that's one major change that's occurred. The other one is, of course, the interest these days, particularly on the environmental side of waste management. That's become an industry of its own. And the other thing that affects it from the legal standpoint, sometimes it's much more difficult to do things these days that needed doing. For example, the management of nuclear waste and where you put these things. That's gotten extremely complicated. There are a lot of people involved in it, and you have a lot of hindrances, I suppose, to doing things that you certainly didn't have a number of years ago. The other thing is the order of magnitude. It used to be, for example, that we could measure radioactivity in air, for example, and we measured in terms of microcuries per cubic meter. And that was a convenient unit to use. Well, now we're dealing in picocuries or attocuries or femtocuries and so forth. So just the order of magnitude in the measurements side of this have changed by several orders of magnitude. And this in itself is a large difference. So those are some of the differences that I see, but I think in general that we're probably head in the right direction as far as health physics or environmental engineering. But life's just gotten a little more difficult by some of the hurdles that been put in our
Do you
path.
have some suggestions on where to go, how to go, that might be useful to?
Well, we're
Future.
eventually going to have to come to grips on a final basis with the effects or lack of effects of low-level amounts of radioactivity or radiation. And that's something that's hadn't been static. There's been a lot of work done in over the years, but it's still one of these things that's still there, and it's very, very difficult to. And some of this, of course, will never be resolved because you're in the never another land as far as differences of very small numbers from background, either increases or decreases from it. So that area is there and will be for some time to come. So,
as you point out, it has gotten very legalized, politicized. It's sometimes difficult. Obviously, there's some good things about having regulations, but only if the regulations really support the safety.
that's right.
Yeah. We're getting, I think, sort of toward the end of this interview, and I'd like to certainly ask what you're proudest of, what you consider the highest achievements, what will remember you, not your work in many areas, but what do you think has been among your outstanding achievements?
Well, I'm not too sure I'd call them technicals. I guess I'd like to be remembered as being someone that was honest, that had a degree of integrity, and was loyal. I mean, these things sound like Boy Scout
Yeah.
things, but and certainly my involvement over a period of time. I didn't mention my family, but we have 5 children. I mentioned some of their involvement in Georgia Tech. And we returned to Atlanta, which was a good thing, I guess. In our case, we came here in '72. But I guess one thing that I'm very proud of is the people that, for example, I've been involved with. Some of them in a training or educational setting, but many of them just on a professional basis, working with. And I'd use this in a very broad sense. I've always believed that training people or the next generation was a responsibility of all of us, whether you're labeled as a teacher, a professor, or something else, or whether you have anything directly to do with an educational program. People still learn from interactions, and I guess I've never found anybody that you couldn't learn something from. So this is a broad definition of that, but if you took, for example, our program here at Tech in the health physics area over a period of time, I don't know how many hundreds of people that we've trained, but it would be a prodigious sort of a number. But a number of these folks, of course, are, and like I say, I'll use this in a broad sense for my definition, that you don't have to be a teacher to gain these positive things. But people, for example, you certainly would know all of these that I would mention. But in the health physics area, some of our graduates, for example, and I'm always at a loss to think, well, you're going to leave out obviously some. So with that caveat that undoubtedly a number of people would be left out if you say name a few. But some of the people that I think of when I think of our graduates, for example, are Paul Sharp, who's with Environmental Protection Agency here in Atlanta, Paul Frame, who's at Oak Ridge, I believe in the Oak Ridge Associated Universities. People that I didn't train directly, but I interacted with here at Tech. John Till, for example, who runs the Radiation Assessment Corporation and has been involved in dose reconstruction activities on a national basis. John Poston, who was a fellow faculty member with us here and now is at Texas A&M.
And also sent his children here.
Yes, he
And
sent
go into
several
health
of his
physics,
children
yes.
here, absolutely. So he's manufactured his own health physics group. And then there are people like Nancy Harmer, for example, who was a daughter of a faculty member. Nancy now is an oncologist here in Atlanta. Cindy Jones, a graduate of our program, now works for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the health physics area. We have people such as yourself that part of this program, not as a student, but as a faculty member for many, many years. And I certainly would mention Mike Ryan, again, one of our graduates. So in a broad sense, people such as those that you see out there make you very proud of the program and your involvement with it. And I guess the other thing, when I think of honors and this sort of thing, I ended up with 3 letters, I guess, from presidents. I mean, real presidents. And
Of the United States.
yeah. One of these, of course,
And his wife.
yeah, Ronald Reagan appointed me to the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board in 1989, I believe it was. And I served in that capacity for 3 years or so, and then I had a letter from George Bush and Mrs. Bush commending me for my activities on that board. And then I also had a earlier letter from Richard Nixon about my involvement in the nuclear test Cannikin up in Alaska, which was the largest test we've had in the United States, and this was a 5 megaton Spartan warhead. The only problem with the letter was that he misspelled Cannikin. So
Anybody could do that.
very much so, but I've always chuckled about that. I think he had a C in there when it should have been a K.
Or maybe he was just sorry that he thought it should have been spelled that way.
That's quite possible.
Yeah. Well, you've done a tremendous amount in your lifetime. I'm certainly very proud to have been associated in some small way with you, worked for you and with you for a while.
No.
I
Thank
really
you.
feel that this, what you have done can be a guideline for future health physicists. Thank you very much for sharing this.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay.
You've done a good job. Thanks a lot, Bern.